Hi, everyone. We have a special guest with us today, the amazing author and artist, Mira Bartok. Mira, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Sandra.
It's an honor for me. I read your memoir, The Memory Palace, 6 years ago, and it touched me so deeply because it was the first time I could see myself and my mum in another story, in a book. And though your story centers around the relationship you shared with your schizophrenic mum, you also had a very layered story that you were able to share with us. And I loved that because humans, we are layered, and it's not just about schizophrenia. You shared with us parts of your family, for example, your grandparents, your grandfather, who was a complicated man who could become violent. You shared with us the hardships that people who are homeless endure. I perceived a very strong bond that you share with your sister Natalia, and you walked us through your journey as an artist and also talked about your traumatic brain injury. So I found your book to be such an inspiration, and I saw myself. So for me, it's a thrill to be with you today. And my question to start with, Mira, how hard was it for you to write The Memory Palace?
Ah, um, that's a complicated question. So I started actually writing a memoir. I knew that it was a memoir. Probably I went back to school. I had serious brain injuries in 1999, and in 2000, I think 2003 or four, I went back to get a second MFA, and this was in fiction and nonfiction, so it was creative writing. And I had written, I think, one or two chapters in the book as essays originally before my accidents. The big one was getting hit by an 18-wheeler tractor trailer. That was fun. But anyway, I thought it would help to go back to school and do muscular reading, even though I was a little older, and get feedback from in writing groups and so on, and get feedback from mentors. And I didn't think I was going to write a memoir at all. I came there with a novel, but I couldn't get my mother out of, like, everything I wrote, from like a nature essay to a short story to this novel I was working on. My mother would just show up. There would always be a mentally ill woman. There would always be this image of her. And so I thought, okay, just go ahead and do it. But the problem was I had and continue to have memory problems. And so one of the main problems with writing the book was I would write something, say I'd sit down and work on a chapter. By the next morning, I'd have absolutely no memory of ever working on that chapter. So I thought, Mira, you worked for years in museums and you were very organized. And, I taught children and adults in museums, but I also did some, I worked sort of behind the scenes and worked in labeling and filing and all these systems that when you work in a museum, especially if you work with exhibits, you have to do. And so what I ended up doing is building a cabinet with different slots, and every slot related to a different chapter. And at the end of working on something every day, I made sure I printed it out, and I put whatever I wrote, even if it was stupid and something I never was going to use, I put it in that slot for that particular chapter, so that by the next morning I could pull it out and go, oh, I guess I wrote yesterday.
Right.
So that was probably the main thing. But also, when you have a TBI, traumatic brain injury, you have a lot of, in my case, organizational issues and just various cognitive issues. And so I came up with systems and how to organize this book. And two things that helped me. One was I focused on every chapter. Once I would do like sort of free writes and so on, once I got a sense of where that chapter was going, I made a decision. There's going to be a theme here, and this is the theme. Whether I defied that theme later or not, that was fine. But I wanted to keep a focus, and so I would come up with a theme, whether it was memory or whether it was something to do with nature or wildness, or whether it had to do with my mother's transformation, from well to ill. And the other thing that helped me was I would find a line of poetry that from a poem I loved that really resonated with me, or some ancient proverb or something that sort of kept me connected to that chapter, that sort of resonated in a very deep way to the theme and to what I was writing about. So those things helped me. It's also a difficult thing to write a memoir anyway on an emotional level, and also you go through different stages, and you find yourself, a lot of people, like I help edit. In the past, periodically I'll help edit people's or work as a mentor for people working on memoirs. And one of the things I notice is that there's a lot of anger that comes out. Usually it's someone writing about, it's often someone writing about their mother, sometimes their father, but it's often, the mother-daughter relationship is very complicated, even if that person is really mentally ill, or anger toward a sibling, maybe the sibling didn't help as much, and so on. And I found that in early drafts, I had some resentment toward my sister for not, in my mind, not helping as much, anger toward my grandfather. And what helped me always was this line from the nature writer and essayist Annie Dillard, who said, writing about family should be an art, not a martial art.
Oh,
so
wow.
So my goal was to always circle back to a place of compassion and empathy about everyone in that realm of family, because you can't blame someone for being mentally ill. You can't blame someone for, people can only do as much as they can do. And so I found myself after 2 or 3 drafts, I found myself in a place really of love. And I wrote many, not just 2 or 3 drafts, several drafts, but a lot of people stop at that place of blaming and of victim, I'm a victim. I had a horrible life.
Right.
Well, there is, whoever said, some author said, you get no credit for suffering. It's really what you do with it.
Right.
And so my goal has always been, even if it's dark and dark and dark in whatever I write, people need hope.
Yeah.
And especially now. And especially if you live in a family where there's mental illness, because you always have to make that decision, that choice between am I taking care of myself, or am I taking care of this other person? And where does he or she end and I begin? It's very complicated, as you know.
Yeah. Oh,
It's heartbreaking.
when I was reading The Memory Palace, I really felt for your mum and your family, because it was a different time, and the medication wasn't as good as it is today, because I know that 20 years ago, my mum was able to get on a medication that's called Fluanzol, and it was night and day. Once they were able to get the right dose, and it was because there's a period of trials of finding the right doses,
Right.
and finding if it's best every 3 weeks or every 3.5 weeks. And it comes down to almost these very specific things that make the difference between a functioning adult who, I don't know if my mum, when she was better, very stable, and she lasted that way about 13, 16 years, I don't know if the voices ever went away completely. There's a before and an after. The sweet mum that was there before, and then this other person who you even reference as Medusa melding with your mum and coming apart. Their situation mentally is so difficult for them. If we can imagine maybe a radio going on all the time, and that becomes annoying for them, it's the voices that ultimately dominate and make your mum paranoid and start to question you, and you're going through that as a child. And that's why I wanted to mention that every story is so layered. So I know that you had your relationship with your mum, but then there was also the part of you being a child in your formative years who needed support and guidance and protection. And then that support was complicated with your grandparents, with your grandfather. And so it is so complex and heartbreaking, and it never stops. It never stops.
You know, I think one of the things you said about this change, I have barely any memories of my mother being normal. I think I have maybe 3 vague memories. But one of the huge gifts that I got after my book came out was that quite a few people from my mother's neighborhood who grew up with her were still alive, and they would show up at events, and they knew my mother before she became ill at 19. And so I got this picture of her that was like, oh my God, we were twins. She and I were so alike. My mother was a musical prodigy, it was clear.
Yes.
But music was my first love too. And so, you know, I always played several instruments, and, you know, and I was in orchestra, and I was in, you know, choir, and accompanied all the, you know, plays, and some of the plays, and piano, and, you know, and played violin and harp and all these things. And we were in the same, you know, social events in school. And I got this picture of my mom just as this really kind-hearted, really loyal friend. And I got very close to her best friend from childhood. And it turned out that when my mother went off to music conservatory, her best friend, Margie, and her sister Claire got my mother's piano. And I got to sit down and play my mother's piano years later. It was amazing. So I you know, one thing that I always told people, you know, who have someone who has schizophrenia or anything like, you know, bipolar disorder, any kind of illness is oops, oh, my light just went on. Don't forget that inside, that person's still there. Their heart is still there. Their soul is still there. That this illness has taken them hostage. And sometimes it's hard for people to understand if they don't really understand mental illness. When you talk about the radio playing in your head, one guy I met in a psych ward when I used to visit my mom said to me, it was like being plugged in to every outlet in the entire house, and every cord going into his head was someone else, was a different radio. And when my mom was in the hospital dying, the last thing she said to me, she turned to me, and she always heard a male voice. She always heard one voice, and it was a male, some man telling her what to do. And the last thing she said to me was, she whispered, he has to go. He has to go now. And I said, who has to go? She said, the one who talks to me. He's going now. And that's the last thing she ever said. And then she just sort of drifted away. And it's like he was with her all those years and wouldn't go away. It was so sad.
I loved at the end of your memoir, it was as if she had come back, and there was her essence was there with you. It wasn't like in previous situations where it was conflicting and she was perhaps interrogating. There was a piece to her, having lived with a schizophrenic mum, and just it's like you struggle every day, all hours of the day, and then there was a peace.
Yeah, and it also was my childhood friend Kathy, I had been looking for her for a long time, but she married somebody named last name Smith and took his name, and she didn't have really an internet presence. She was a fourth grade teacher, and I had lost track of her. And right before I found my mom, like 2 months before, Kathy and I reunited, and I went to Cleveland. And so Kathy was there at the end, at those last days too. And she also, made something for her room, and she brought stuff in and made it really homey. Ever since then, this group of girls that I grew up with in the neighborhood, we've been getting together every summer at a cottage, and we have all reunited. And so there was a sort of full circle thing that happened, and it was just it was pretty amazing.
Wow.
And also just, I can't say enough about hospice workers. They were so astounding, and they have seen it all. And so it was very peaceful. It was really peaceful.
And
And
I
yeah.
perceived that. I perceived that. And I also perceived what you mentioned about having more of a empathetic vision of your story instead of being, oh, and this happened, and kind of dwelling, making it like. And then my grandfather, when he was violent, there was no dwelling on the situations. It was as if you were observing them, but in an also empathetic manner. It wasn't, and he did this or she was this way. It was observing with a kind heart.
Well, I always felt bad for everyone in my family. I just felt they all had, I think about my grandfather, he had like a second grade education. He was an immigrant. He and my grandmother just hated each other. It was horrible. He was awful to her, but she provoked him and was awful to him. And it was, I mean, nobody should be violent to any domestic partner or anyone. That said, my grandmother was not completely guilt-free. But I remember I had a very close friend who was really like my surrogate mom. Her name was Nancy Plotkin, and when I lived in Chicago, and she passed away a few years ago. And she said something to me when I was younger. I met her when I was about 19, and in art school, and she said, I would think she was asking about my mom. She knew my mom was mentally ill. And then she said, and asked me about different members of the family. And she said, well, what gifts did they give you? And that sort of changed everything. And I really had to think, well, my grandmother gave me a sense of humor, sometimes very dark humor in the face of adversity. She really was a funny person, as difficult as her life was. I thought my grandfather, he taught me how to garden. He taught me how to ride a bike. He was the one who actually took us to do kid things like ride ponies and go feed the ducks at the park and to go to the zoo. My grandmother had no interest in that, and my mother tried, but she was so ill. And and my mother gave me music, and my mother believed in me. She always believed in me as an artist. And it's interesting, like now, I feel like writing this book sort of allowed me afterwards to finally write fiction, and as well as do books for children as well. And so, now I'm mostly at the moment writing and illustrating books for children. And one of the last things she said to me, I said, do you have any regrets in your life? And she said, two things. The few like moments of lucidity. She was about 5% lucid. She said, I wish I had learned the double bass, how to play the double bass,
Right.
stand-up bass, just double bass. And I was like, I could see that.
Yeah.
Love the double bass. And she said, and I wish I wish I could have made books where you combined words and pictures. And I said, well, I'm doing that right now. And she said, you're going to be so great at it. I believe you will be so great at it. I believe in you. And so that was pretty great. I didn't say I'm writing a memoir about you. I sort of skipped that part.
Right. Yeah.
I did, yeah. But anyway,
I recall that conversation because you share the projects that you were working on, and she said, "I believe it. I always had faith in you," and that was beautiful. That was beautiful. When you described your mum's behavior, it was as if you were describing my own mum, the furious pacing, the suspicious darting eyes, the endless interrogations, and also aggression and violence. As a child, how do you think these circumstances impacted your character?
I'm not sure. I think I do know, I mean, not my character, but I know on a physiological level, I developed PTSD or PTSD, not, I didn't relive things, but it made me jumpy.
Right.
So if someone comes up behind me suddenly, or when people goof around and they suddenly put their hands on the back of your neck or your shoulders, or they put their hands over your eyes, I'll go like that. And that still happens. And I've never really been I go to sleep, I fall asleep, but I wake up a lot. And I know that's from having just, my mother would come I don't know if your mom did this too, but she would come into the bedroom like all hours of the night and just like interrogate me, or just say the Nazis are outside, or, and so, it's been I know, people don't think of me as a jumpy person actually, but there are situations where I do get jumpy. As far as my character, I don't know. I'm not sure about that question. How about you?
I was always an introvert, but
Yeah,
after my mum, the difference between her being normal and then schizophrenia, I was a worse introvert. I couldn't talk. So then that affected my social relations in school. I really suffered with learning. So my self-esteem was almost nothing. And then it flipped in high school, which is junior high for you guys. I became really quite loud and aggressive. Not physically, but it was like, what are you looking at? And then I just became like this harder person, when inside you're just really calling out for help, really. In the early years, I was quiet. I went within myself.
Yeah.
I couldn't really talk. And I always think about that part of kind of primary school, because obviously they're your formative years, and that's when you need your parents the most. And when I interviewed Dr. Margaret Brown, she's the author of Growing Up with a Schizophrenic Mum, she mentioned that it's usually worse for the children who have schizophrenic mothers as opposed to a schizophrenic father, because generally the guardianship or the weight of the formation is usually with the mum. So taking that into consideration, that you're in your formative years, and then all of a sudden there's neglect as well, because maybe you're sent off to school without breakfast, and then there's so many weird things happening, and you still have to keep up with assignments that have your parents like input in those assignments, and your parents aren't actually there. It's like, and then it becomes a thing about shame. Like, why are you the only kid that doesn't have the homework, like maybe a baked cake or a baked dessert, and you're the only one there, or you have it there,
or you do it yourself and say it's from your mother.
Yeah, and that's sad, I think with my character as a child, I just was so insecure. I had nobody really to tell me, hey, you're a smart kid. Those things that you're told that build up your self-esteem, and that can give you that kind of impulse to keep going in life, even if you make mistakes. But as a child, it's so important. But at the same time, and I was talking to my brother, he's older than me, and I said, well, we were lucky because though we didn't have our parents saying, oh, you're the smartest kid, or, you're so talented, wow, you sing, whatever. We didn't have that, but we also didn't have parents that said, you're rubbish, you're not worth anything. I don't even know why you're here. The kinds of parents that really break down their kids. So I said to my brother, I'm so grateful that we were kind of on neutral ground, despite all of the turmoil.
I would say that a lot of what you're saying really resonates with me when I think about it. I was extremely, extremely shy.
Right.
As a really small child, very withdrawn. I insisted that I was a cat, and I hid under tables, and I wanted to be treated like a cat.
Yeah.
And I really, I think, sort of depended on my sister a lot, because she was more outgoing, and she was, as some older siblings are, very bossy, but not in a mean way. She also, she would teach. We had this little group that, it was sort of a little club, and my sister would teach us how to read and write, and teach us little poems and things. And we had a secret password. And so I lived in, one of those neighborhoods where, you weren't afraid to walk around, and you played with the kids on the block. And, there was a greater sense of community. It's just not like that now in many places. And so there was a certain safety, even though it wasn't safe at home. The outside was safe. And also I was, I was a little observer. So I was always drawing, and always making things up. And I think that by the time I would say 8th grade, I started coming out of my shell a bit. And I always had kind of a goofy sense of humor. And so I kind of met my tribe. And I wanted to sort of get in trouble, but I was so good. I remember one time in junior high, I think I was in 8th grade, and I was sitting in the library, and I wanted to do something naughty because I was just such goody two shoes. And I had this rotten apple, and I threw it. It's so sacrilegious now to think of me throwing a rotten apple at a bookshelf, but I threw it at the wall, which was all lined with books, and the librarian happened to walk by just that moment. I hit her in the head. I got dragged to the only time I ever got dragged to the principal's office. And the principal looked at the librarian, and said, she would never do something like that. You made a mistake. So, but by the time I got to high school, I really wanted to get over my terror of speaking in front of people, and my terror of, I was in this gifted program, and we had to give these talks. And I was always interested in other cultures, so I would be doing something on the ancient Maya or Haiti or something. And I would make these elaborate charts and make these beautiful things, but I'd get up and I'd be like, I just had such a hard time talking, and I would pee in my pants. I mean, it was horrible. A large part of that was being in public with suddenly my mother would suddenly start screaming and saying really embarrassing things, and I would just die of embarrassment. I didn't want anyone to look at me. So I just thought, you've got to get over this.
Right.
And so I started getting involved in the theater department when I was in, I think, 10th grade. That was great because I started out, doing sets, and and I often was in the orchestra pit accompanying, on piano. But then I started, singing and dancing in the chorus, and then I took a couple, and then I got a couple parts where I actually was on stage. And once I would get my groove on, I was okay. But ultimately, I still preferred being backstage or in the orchestra pit, or in the orchestra. One of the reasons I left as a working artist, and I was in galleries, and I just hated gallery openings. um, being the center of attention. So, and I was also secretly writing stories and things. And one of the things I thought about was, well, if you're an author, you can just have your books and stories. You never have to do anything in public. Boy, was I wrong, especially when the Memory Palace came out, because I was on the road for like 2 years and not just reading my book, but giving,
Right.
talks about mental illness and um, homelessness, and uh, it was exhausting. But once I'm totally fine when I'm reading, and I'm fine afterwards with the Q&A. I
Right.
can be a total goofy person. It's getting up in front of an audience and just saying those, first few words to the sea of people.
Right.
I just, you know,
It's not
I,
easy.
it's hard. And I think about singers, like I know a lot of musicians, and I said to a friend of mine who's a really great baritone, and he does a lot of solo, mostly Baroque and classical pieces. And I said, how do you get up and sing a solo in front of all these people? And he said, they're just people. It's just singing. And he said, and then I also imagine them all naked and more
All
embarrassed than I am.
right.
So
Yeah,
I never did that when I spoke.
exactly. No, I don't do that.
Sometimes I imagine um, that everyone has a little puppy or kitten in their lap, and they're all sort of sitting
Oh,
around the fire, and
yes.
and that helps. It sort of makes them more human.